guys, it is Kelly Dale with Off the Beaded Path Beadstore.com. And you'll notice the video looks a little different today because I have a very good friend with me, Meredith from Bead Alon. And I have asked Meredith specifically to come on today to talk about thread because over the last couple of weeks, I have gotten a ton of questions about thread, specifically thread in poundage, what we are, a lingo could be, versus a diameter of thread and such. So I said, okay, let's get the expert on here to tell us all about thread. So Meredith, thank you so much for being with me today. I really appreciate you.
Anytime I get to hang out and talk about beading thread with people who will actually listen to me, well, it is a good day.
Yeah.
As you'll see, once I get going, Kelly, you're gonna be like, Meredith, like, let me just cut in. It's enough about the thread already.
Like we're over it. Oh no. I think it's very important, especially new beaters all the way up to advanced beaters, to understand the differences in the thread, because the biggest issue I have as a store owner is when a new thread comes on the market, so many people will try a new thread, they'll give it one try and they're like, oh my gosh, I hate this thread. I don't want this thread. This thread's horrible. But and I always tell people, you need to do at least 6 to 8 projects with a new thread, because you don't know exactly what that thread's going to be great for and what that thread's not going to be great for. Like the new Ultra that Beat Alon has out. It is fantastic. I love the thread. I love it, especially for bead embroidery, because it just glides through and it just makes bead embroidery so easy and nice. And you can use a small needle with it. And I love it. But, there's people who are like, hey, that's so thin. And some people are like, I can't get my needle to stick in it. So, there's always issues with thread. So what I would love for you to do to explain to us today is some differences in threads. Now, I understand not all threads are going to be the same, but so explain to us the difference in the threads. And when somebody says like Fireline, for instance, okay, we have a 6-pound Fireline, but in the Bead Alon version of Wildfire, what somebody would call a 6-pound is thicker than the Fireline. So can you explain the lingo between poundage and diameter and why that makes a huge difference?
I absolutely will. I wanted to glom on to one of the things that you said, though, which I think is the best place to start all of this, which is not what one thread does not fit all projects. And
Right.
that if people take nothing else away from our conversation today, I want that to be the takeaway message: is one thread does not fit all projects. And that's why there are so many different threads out there. Also, I want to mention that not one thread fits all people. And so there are preferences out there, and some people simply prefer one thread over another, and that's okay. But from an advice perspective, I like talking about what my favorite threads are for each specific project. But before we get into all of that, we need to step back and talk about what are all of these threads? What are all of these words? Because you and I, Kelly, we live and breathe this. We know Fireline, we know Wildfire Ultra, we know NYMO, we know 1G, we know KO, like all of the different threads out there that might be Bead Alon branded or not Bead Alon branded. I have used all of them. And I use each of them in a different way for a different project. And the further along you get in your beading journey, a lot of it becomes really just kind of second nature. Like, oh, I'm making fringe, I'm going to use NYMO, or I'm making this kind of fringe. Wildfire Ultra is a new product, and that's my favorite for that. Or like you just said, bead embroidery. I never thought to use Wildfire Ultra for bead embroidery. Now I'm going to try that. And like you said, kind of a couple projects in, I'm going to see whether or not I like Wildfire Ultra for bead embroidery. That's one of the things that I don't struggle with it, but I haven't it hasn't clicked for me in that way of like a cubic right angle weave. It took me a while, but finally it clicked. Bead embroidery hasn't quite clicked for me, and I'm looking forward to when it does though. So let's back up a couple steps and let's just tackle one category, right? There are lots of different categories within these stringing materials as well. The category that I want to talk about today is the kind of thermally bonded / fused category. And those products are going to be Fireline, Wildfire, and Wildfire Ultra. So those are the three things that I really want to focus on in our conversation today. And to understand why people talk about Fireline in terms of pound and why Wildfire we talk about in terms of diameter, there's a very simple reason for that. And that is because Fireline was originally taken from the fishing industry. And when you are a fisher person, diameter doesn't matter in your fishing line. It really doesn't. What matters is pound strength. And really what pound strength means is break strength. And why break strength is important is because when you're fishing, you want to make sure that your break strength is, for lack of a larger discussion about fishing, is the right break strength for the fish that you're trying to catch. So if you're trying to catch a shark, you're going to have a different break strength than if you're going to try to catch a river trout. And I think that's just kind of where I'll leave it because we don't need to go down the road of fishing. But that's why Fireline is talked about and described in terms of break strength and not diameter. On the Beaded spools, and I think on other spools of Fireline as well, it does talk about diameter, but when you're reading a pattern, when you're listening to an instructor, when you're watching a YouTube video, I would say 10 times out of 10, when that person or that instructor, that beater is referring to Fireline, they're going to talk about it in terms of break strength. It's just industry convention. That's just how it started in the beginning and how it has gone through time. And the break strength of Fireline does correspond to diameter. And luckily for many beaters, it's kind of a 1-to-1. So the break strength of Fireline, 6 pound, right? We talk about 6 pound Fireline a lot, is actually a 0.006 diameter. That's pretty easy to make that comparison. A break strength of 4 pound Fireline, however, is a 0.005 diameter. So not quite as kind of put my glasses down for the small spool. A break strength of 8 pound Fireline is actually a 0.007 diameter. So like really the one that lines up the most is the double, and we at Beaded we say 006. So 0.006 or 006 to 6 pound. And Kelly, would you agree this is kind of the go-to for most projects? People are using a 6 pound.
Yeah, absolutely. Most people across the board, if you use Fireline, you've got big spools of 6 pound because that's kind of your medium go-to, will almost do everything.
Yep. Let's get back to that medium go-to, almost do anything point in a second. So Wildfire is a little bit different because when I came to Beaded 17 years ago, we had an amazing product called Dandelion. And Dandelion was a woven, actually, I'm going to go down to the secret.
I know when you said I was actually
Dandelion.
I was like, I might still have a roll of that in my drawer over here.
Yeah, and it's an amazing product. And this actually, just as a quick aside, is my favorite go-to for fringe, is the Dandelion. Dandelion is unbelievably strong. It is made out of the same stuff that bulletproof vests are made out of. And it was our kind of go-to standard for seed bead weaving until I arrived. And I had used Fireline before and realized that Fireline's strength is that it is a fused thread. Okay, so that's kind of our segue into we're going to jump back. It's not going to be a segue. We're going to jump back to talking about fused and unfused in just a moment. But because the dandelion is not fused, you can pierce it with a needle. And when you're doing a lot of seed bead weaving and you are doing multiple passes and around, and you're filling up those size 11 or even size 15 seed beads a lot, the reason why Fireline excels is because it's fused and it's very difficult to pierce with a needle. So we had this great product, Dandelion, but before I arrived, nobody at Beadle actually did any seed bead weaving. And so they didn't really understand why it was so important to have something that was fused. So we worked and tested and tested. And then we developed Wildfire. And because Wildfire was developed 100% fully and foremost for beading, not for fishing, we went with the convention that we do in beading, which is talking about diameter. So when we talk about bead stringing wire, when we talk about elasticity or stretch cord, when we talk about almost any other bead weaving or bead stringing material, we talk about it in terms of diameter. And that's why we, when we developed Dandelion, decided not to talk about it in terms of pound strength, but to talk about it in terms of diameter.
Okay.
Additionally, just to make everything even a little bit more confusing, the 0.006 diameter, which you might remember from 0.0066 pound Fireline, the 0.006 diameter of Wildfire actually has a break strength of 10 pounds.
Okay.
Because diameter for diameter, Wildfire is actually stronger. So if you pull on it, this is what break strength is. If you pull on it, you've got one thing wrapped around over here and one thing wrapped around over here, and you put 6 pounds of tension on it, Fireline's going to break.
Okay.
Wildfire's not going to break. You're going to keep pulling and pulling and pulling until you get to 10 pounds of tension. Mm-hmm. And at 10 pounds of tension, give or take, that's when the Wildfire is going to break.
Okay.
The takeaway message from that is if you're hanging something off of Fireline or you're hanging something off of Wildfire, Wildfire is going to be stronger. The next logical conclusion is, as you're doing bead weaving, if you're bead weaving with Fireline or you're bead weaving with Wildfire, your Wildfire is going to be a little stronger. Okay. When you are bead weaving with size 11 seed beads, mm-hmm. the difference is immaterial as far as I'm concerned. When things start to matter is maybe I'm going to incorporate some 8mm bicone crystals in there.
Right.
That's when things kind of start mattering for when you really need to make a decision about strength of material. So let's back up a couple steps to what I had mentioned earlier, which is fused versus not fused. Because what is the difference between Fireline and Wildfire? It's a really good question. And if you touch them, diameter for diameter, 006 to 006, you can feel that there's a difference.
Yes.
The Fireline feels more like a monofilament, like a fishing line, like a supple max, or a just something from a tackle box, right?
Right.
The Wildfire feels more like thread. It's a little more supple. It's a little drapier. I mentioned earlier, it's a little bit better for fringe. And the difference is in this little word right here, microfused, and this right here where it says thermally bonded.
Okay.
So without getting into the minutia of what that matters, Fireline is melted together. Uh-huh. Okay, so it's melted, and when you look at it, it's all one thing, right? It's like a monofilament. It's one filament because it's melted and fused together. Wildfire is threads on the inside with a coating over top. Okay. And that coating over top actually is melted into the threads, but there's still a core of white threads in here.
Right.
So you can, if you use, I don't know, a razor or a cutter of some kind, you can kind of, file away the coating on the Wildfire and see that core underneath. Mm-hmm. All it is how it's made. Different things are made different ways. And the fire line, like I mentioned, it's fused together. It's all melted together. It's one single filament. And that's what makes it a little stiffer. And so for some projects, you want that a little stiffer, right? That's like if you're doing a bracelet that you want to have some good structure to it, a thicker fire line is going to be our go-to. But if you want that same bracelet to have a little more drape, if you want it to be more of a necklace that has more of a kind of a silk or a thread-like feel to it, wildfire is going to be your go-to. So I think in all of that, I touched on really the crux of what you are asking, Kelly, which is the pound difference, what that means. And also what's the difference, right? What is the makeup? Why is Fireline different from Wildfire? Because they're not the same. They can be used in a lot of the same applications, but they're not exactly one-to-one, apples to apples the same. The other thing that I want to mention is we talked about the 006 6-pound Fireline to the 0.006 or the 006 10-pound Wildfire. But Wildfire, we also have in a 0.008, which is even thicker than the 8-pound Fireline. It would be more equivalent to, I think, a 10-pound Fireline, which we have it in 2 put-ups at Beadalon, but I don't see it out in the wild very often, and I don't hear it being called for in patterns very much. But the 008 Wildfire is great when you're doing bracelets where you're not doing a lot of passes, but when we bead, we always want to, it's kind of that sweet spot between being able to get our thread through the beads the amount of times that we want, but also fill those beads up as much as possible. So you have good structure, so you have good form for your bracelet. So the 008 is something I like to use if I'm just doing like a one strong design, or like I'm mentioning a bracelet that I want to have a lot of structure, but I don't have my pattern doesn't call for a lot of passes through it.
Okay, well, I do have a question.
And that's 20 minutes on stringing material.
No, it's great. If nothing else, I have learned a new bougie word. I'm going to start calling it 006 because that just makes me feel all kinds of good. 007 is going to jump out at any time. But with the 006, when you look at your wildfire and your fire line together, one of the comments that I get a lot as a store owner is the 006 in the fire line feels thinner than the 006 in the wildfire. Is that because the wildfire has that core with that coating that makes it feel a little bit thicker than the fire line?
Yep. So one of the challenges is when you mic this stuff, that's what you call it when you measure it, when you use something called a micrometer. And when you're getting down to such unbelievably small, we're talking thousands, 6,000ths of an inch.
Right.
The wildfire can sometimes not be perfectly round. And I think that's why it mics at 006 a little thicker than the fire line at the same diameter. That's my theory, according to Meredith. I don't know if that's actually true, because you're right, and I'm holding them together, and the fire line is thinner than the wildfire. And I think that you're right, Kelly. I think it is because of the way that it is constructed, that the fire line is fused and the wildfire has a coating on it. And I think that that's important to know as you're going through and choosing, back to what we were talking about at the very, very beginning of our chat, when you're choosing your material for your project, knowing that 006 is just that hair's breadth. I'm sorry, the 006 wildfire is just that hair's breadth thicker than the wildfire helps inform your decision about which material you want to use for your project.
Right. And And to me, all of that goes back to where we started in the beginning of people have to understand that not every thread is going to work for every single project. In a beater's toolbox, we need all of the different sizes because of different things like that. 0.008 in the wildfire, I personally love to use it for things that I want structure because it is a little bit thicker. It holds that really good structure that I'm wanting, like a vessel or something like that, that maybe I'm only going to be making 2 passes, through my beads. They work great for that. So you always kind of have to play around and figure out which thread works the best, because there are some tried and true. I'm only going to use Fireline. I'm not going to use anything else. And then you've got people like me who are like, I want to try everything that comes out, because again, everything is different and everything has its own great things. It's just like when the Ultra came out. I love the Ultra because, like I said, it's great for doing bead embroidery. I've done some encasements with it, and it's so nice. But, I had to call you and say, okay, I can't get my needle to stay on here. What do I do, Meredith? So, I mean, even sometimes your needles make a difference. So, can you kind of speak to how sometimes your needle choice can also deal with our thread? Because I want you to tell the people what you told me about using the Ultra and the kind of needle I needed with an Ultra.
So, yes. Much like not one thread is for every project, not one needle is for every project either. Right. And intuitively knowing, or just by trial and error, figuring out what needle works best with what thread and what needle works best for what project is another huge portion of this pie, of this puzzle, of this whole of creating that we have. Unfortunately, it's not just as easy as like, here's my number 12 needle, here's my stringy material, here are my beads, I'm gonna go. Sure, you can do that, but you might end up having some challenges down the road. And Kelly, I'm sure that you have had a lifetime of challenges where you figured out what you like best, as have I. And sometimes it can be incredibly frustrating, but we go through it so that we can have these conversations and share the knowledge. Mm-hmm. So for the Wildfire Ultra, because it is also not fused the way that the Fireline is, and it's also, the coating is a little bit different even than the Wildfire, it can be very challenging to get this stuff on through a number 12 or even a number 10 needle. When you do, because it is so fine and because it is so slippery, which are things that make it great for bead embroidery, it makes it very challenging to keep it in that needle, which is super frustrating because you finally gotten the darn thing through the eye of the needle and it just comes right out because it's so slippery. So what I recommended to Kelly, and what I always recommend to use with Wildfire, is a big eye beading needle. It's going to be much easier. I'm just looking around to see. I think behind me I have a bag of needles. I'll grab them in a second. It is much easier not only to open up that needle and poke the thread through, but it also holds on to it so it doesn't go anywhere when you're beading. And there are fine big eye beading needles, there are long big eye beading needles, there are thick big eye needles. Anything that you need for your project, there are needles out there in all different types of needles to make it work. The key to any of this, though, unless you're using a big eye needle or a collapsible eye needle, is to make sure that you take the end of your material, you take a chain nose pliers and you flatten that material so that you can just get that little bit in your pinched in your fingers and push the top of the needle onto your thread. Makes a huge difference. I can't thread a needle without flattening it. I don't know if you can thread a needle without flattening your material. And that is how you can get the Wildfire Ultra into a regular needle. But again, it is so fine and it is so thin that even if you're using a size 13 needle, it's really, really slippery. So it's going to slide out. The one thing that I haven't played around with, Kelly, and you actually might be able to advise me on this, is do you condition your Wildfire Ultra?
I have not. It is so slick. It just
Yeah.
slides through things so easily. Excuse me. But now I was chuckling as you were talking about threading it because, oh, I can get that needle threaded. But then I'm the one who's going to sit there and refuse to use that big eye needle. And I'm going to use my size 12 needle and I'm going to thread that thing 30 times while I use the Ultra. So I actually started taking and putting a little knot in the very end of my thread so it doesn't come off the needle while I'm working with it.
That's so good. Well, and I was also thinking too for bead embroidery, and again, it's not my number one expert thing, but I might, especially if I were using the Wildfire Ultra, I might do it like old school sewing and double it, knot it at the end.
Yeah, you could totally do that. You could. You absolutely could. So yeah, I love that. Now, I did want to ask you one other question, and this was not in the list of questions that I sent you, so please don't kill me. But I am also a quilter, and there is a quilter named Tula Pink. And I was watching one of her videos the other day, and I gleaned something from Tula, and I was like, this has to work with beading thread too. Tula was saying that when you are working with a spool of thread, and she uses a specific type thread, but when you're working with a spool of thread, when you cut your thread off the spool, you should never try to thread the needle from the end that you cut. You should always do it on the spool, thread your needle while it's on the spool, and you thread it down over the thread. So like if this is the end of my thread, I'm threading the needle while it's still on the spool, and then you pull off what you need and cut it. And this was her reasoning, and it made total sense. And I was like, oh my gosh, when you cut off of a spool, the end that you cut, if you try to thread your needle onto that end, you are working against the grain of the thread because the thread is woven. But then when you go across it and you're going off of that cut end, you're going against the grain of the thread. And she said that's what causes a lot of fraying. That's what causes a lot of issues with when you're using your needle and you're starting to see those weak spots. It's because you've gone against the grain. She said, if you will thread from the end that is on the spool, you're always going with the grain and not against it. So have you ever heard that, or does that pertain to like the Wildfire as well? Or can you speak on that?
That is fascinating. I've never thought of it before, but because Fireline is bonded, and I'm sorry, fused, and Wildfire is bonded, I'm not sure that the same logic applies to a thread that's twisted or braided together and twisted and kind of just exposed. It's just the filaments of the thread. It certainly couldn't hurt.
Yeah, because
the point that I want to pick up on from what you mentioned is the cutting. So one of the challenges that people have a lot is cutting Fireline and cutting Wildfire. You always want a dedicated scissors that is super sharp, and you want to take that thread all the way in the back of your scissors and pull kind of as you're just very barely cutting. Because when you come up here, let me grab, I did that with the Wildfire, I think. If you come in here and try to chomp this Fireline at the front of my scissors and actually cut, it's not going to cut it. But if you come back, double it over, pull into the back of the scissors, then you're going to get a really nice cut. So I don't know about, because there's no grain to a Fireline because it's fused.
Yeah, I
and
wasn't sure how well that
very,
would work with Fireline or Wildfire, but I thought definitely threads like 1G, KO, Mayuki, threads like that that are woven nylon type threads, that would definitely and I said, "Oh man, I got to take that into the bead world and let's see how that accounts for the bead world as well." So that's one of the little things I'm going to be tweaking and playing with. So thank you, Tula Pink, if you're watching by any chance. But
thank her a lot, because all of those materials, the Nymos of the world, all of that stuff came from sewing
yeah.
and from the fabric crafting. And so it would make a lot of sense that that would make a big difference, because just like you're going through fabric over and over again, beads are rough on the inside, especially those glass seed beads. And if you get some crystals involved, it can tear up your thread if you're not careful. Yeah. So I have learned today too. Thank you, Kelly. I love that.
Well,
See?
and back to your scissors comment as well. I think it's really important that people invest in a really, really good pair. Like you said, a very sharp pair of scissors, because like I had a customer a couple of weeks ago, they bought all the cheapest scissors that I have in the store that are made for things, because there's a difference in your scissors too. You have threads that cut like your 1G, your KO, your Mayuki, your Namo, things like that. They cut really easy, but they will not cut a Fireline or a Wildfire or a Dragon thread or something like that. And she was like, these won't cut anything. I'm using it with my Fireline. And I'm like, because they're not made for that. So I think it's very important for beaters as well to educate themselves on the cutters that they purchase or the scissors that they purchase. And I do have a free instant download on my website off the beadedpathbeadstore.com that talks about the different scissors and what they're good for and what they're not good for. And actually the scissors that Meredith is using, was showing with the demo, those are the Beadalon scissors, right, Meredith? Yeah. So I have those in the store and they are great for doing exactly like she showed you. Cause that's another tip too, because I have never taken and put the thread all the way to the shear point of that. So that's another great tip right there. So I mean, we're throwing out free tips today. So any other thread things or thread advice that you might have that we did not cover? Or do you think we covered it all?
We covered a lot, certainly, but I think just framing it by what are you making? That's really the first thing in really any beading that for any material. It is, you start with your pattern. You start with what you're making. You start with what your end result is going to be, and then you work backwards to figure out what is the best material for this job. And it might not just be one, right? If you're making, just the thing that popped into my head is some brick stitch earrings, right? I want that brick stitch part to be one material, but my fringe is going to be something different. My fringe is going to be a Nymo or a 1G or a Wildfire Ultra, something that's going to be thread-like. And then really just play around with all the different materials, because your favorite and my favorite might not be somebody else's favorite, and somebody else who has, come from a different school or a different background of bead weaving might have a totally different perspective on all of this thread stuff. And I love to learn from all different walks of life of beaders. Because everyone has something to share and something to kind of spark an idea in my head for.
Right, exactly. And thankfully, a majority of the beading community is really great with and sharing information that's helpful to other beaders. And we are so grateful to have you in that community, because the videos that you do with Beadalon on the Facebook page, I always learn things there, and just your knowledge of thread. And I'm so thankful for you for coming on and doing this video. And I hope that we were able to show a lot of people the differences of things that they needed to know in their thread, and maybe a little bit of a better way to choose the thread and needle that you need to use for a project. So anything else before we go, Meredith?
Just thank you right back at you, Kelly. It is my joy and my pleasure to be here and have somebody listen to me talk about thread for half an hour. But seriously, you and I don't say this lightly. Whenever I either need a refresher on a stitch, or I need a little bit of inspiration, or I'm just kind of, bored and want to see what people are making, yours is the YouTube channel that I always go to first, because I'm like, Kelly will explain it best. She will give all of the different perspectives, and I know that I'm going to learn what I need to learn, or have my creativity peaked the way I need it to be peaked from you, Kelly. So from the bottom of my heart, I thank you for that gift.
Oh, well, thank you. Well, then you need to make sure to watch next week's video, because I'm working on a whole peyote stitch series. And next week, I'm going to be showing 4 ways to do odd count peyote stitch. So yes,
I'll
4.
be there.
Yes. So it's going to be really, really fun. So again, Meredith, thank you so much. And I hope that we can get together soon and talk about something else in the bead world that we can help our beading friends across the web ways with. So,
I'll be there.
all right.